Welcome to Cinema on a Shelf, a podcast about movies and physical media. My name is Matt, and thank you for spending some time with me instead of watching a movie. I promise I will try to make it worth your time. And welcome to episode number 3, which is a little bit of a week late. Apologies about that. I am trying to keep my schedule to one episode every 2 weeks, but I did have a good reason for taking an extra week this time around, in that I actually went on a bit of a solo movie vacation for myself. I went to Toronto for the Toronto International Film Festival, which was really, really fun. Got to see a couple of movies and also got to go to an experience which actually has something to do with the topic of episode 3, which is a spotlight about the Criterion Collection. So this is going to be the first of a few in a series that I want to do to introduce a few boutique physical media labels that are out there. I mentioned them a little bit in both of my first couple of videos. Criterion Collection, as well as several other boutique labels, is a DVD, Blu-ray, and 4K producer label that does some of the best stuff out there as far as things that you can purchase on physical media, and they've been at it for a very long time. And I want this to be one in a series where I'm doing a bit of a label spotlight. I may do this for other labels that I have some familiarity with, that I have some in my own collection that I can speak a little bit about. I do also want to do some episodes about labels that I don't know a whole lot about, and maybe take a little bit of a journey on my own to pick up a few of those titles and introduce myself to these boutique labels. But today we are talking about what I guess you could probably term as the granddaddy of them all in Criterion. You know, they've kind of invented a lot of what we know, not only about boutique physical media labels, but also a lot of the things that we have on physical media exist in the way they do because of the Criterion Collection. So I wanted to give a little bit of a deep dive into them as a company, as a label, what they produce, how they got to where they are, and also do a little bit of an introduction into something else that I do want to spin off into a few of its own episodes of the podcast, which I'm going to call the Criterion Hall of Fame, which we'll talk about a little bit later on when we get to it. So chances are, if you are into collecting physical media or know anything about it, you have probably heard of the Criterion Collection before. That's because they have been around for a very long time and are a very prestigious, very well-regarded boutique label. They have been producing physical media since even before any of the current physical media platforms have been around. Criterion has been a company since 1984, believe it or not, which does mean that they are, now 41 years old. Last year they celebrated their 40th anniversary as a company. It was founded as a sister company of a film distribution company called Janus Films. And again, if you've seen a Criterion DVD, you may have seen or noticed the Janus Films logo at the beginning of it. It's sort of the two-faced Roman god looking coin with Janus Films on the side. And they were founded as a North American distribution company in 1956 that specifically specialized in distributing foreign and art house films within North America, most particularly in the United States and nearish to where they were founded, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In fact, they originally started out, I believe, in a place called the Brattle Theater, which is just outside of campus at Harvard University. I've never been to Boston or Cambridge myself, so I can't speak to exactly where they are, but they started out as a producer, or pardon me, as a film distribution company that was acquiring rights to films by very prestigious world cinema filmmakers. Some of these filmmakers included people like Ingmar Bergman, like Akira Kurosawa, like Federico Fellini, Michelangelo Antonioni, Sergei Eisenstein, Francois Truffaut, Yasuhiro Ozu, many others that had a lot of very, very notable films in world cinema. And at the time in the 1950s, there was a real growing interest in bringing some of these films to North America. I believe the very first one that was kind of a real impactful film for Janus Films to bring to North America was The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman, which now is a cinema classic that pretty much every film student is going to see at some point in time in their lifetime, probably in their school time. They, started with these types of films that were really gaining some traction internationally. I know other films like The Seven Samurai would have been a big one. Going into the 60s, films like La Aventura, French New Wave films, the, Fellini films from Italy, Eight and a Half, all of these types of films that were starting to be recognized a little bit more in North America as Hollywood was starting to evolve through the 50s and 60s. And they eventually, Janus Films as a company eventually was able to relocate to New York, which was probably the hub of this art house cinema movement. And for years and years and years, they would acquire the rights to show these films in North America and distribute them in different prints throughout North America in whatever kind of was available at that point in time. Film distribution at that time was still on actual celluloid for the most part, even though there were some different processes and film stocks that it could be distributed on. But sometimes you kind of took what you could get with sending prints overseas in whatever type of, maybe they were pristine, maybe they weren't. It sort of depended, I guess, on how far they had come and what sort of negatives and originals they were able to source the prints from. So this happened for many, many years, and they sort of worked within this system of just being a North American distribution company. And with the advent of home video and physical media going from the late 70s into the 80s, they decided to branch out a bit into producing physical media for home video, essentially. This is where the journey of the Criterion Collection comes to be. It is a North American-based home video distribution company, which, as we've talked about in previous episodes, North American distribution for home video has a little bit of a different platform or formatting than it does in Asia or Australia or Europe or Africa or South America. The NTSC versions of things, Region 1, I guess is what you would call it in DVD, or Region A for Blu-ray. Back in that point in time, it was mostly VHS and Betamax at that point in time. And I think VHS was kind of the chief version of it. But Criterion was founded not to produce VHS versions, but mostly to produce laser discs. And because they were, at the time, the highest quality that you could get for any home video release, they decided that they would hitch their wagon to the Laserdisc format and really produce versions of these films that would serve, cinephiles, film and media scholars, libraries, universities, film schools, these sorts of things. People that were a little more discerning cinephiles that wanted to get the best available versions of these films to watch at home. And this was still a pretty new thing in 1984 when it was founded. So they really kind of spearheaded this movement of producing a high quality physical media product for a discerning consumer. This wasn't necessarily something that they produced for mass distribution. That was already sort of happening, and people could go to a video store and rent a VHS, which, although they were very prevalent, it was a lower quality film watching experience at the time, especially in comparison to the more expensive Laserdisc version. Now, this was done originally by some people that were founded by these people that are not currently involved with the company, and eventually there were some people that would become more involved with the company even to this day. Jonathan Terrell, Peter Becker, these are names that you'll see on a lot of credits for Criterion extras and supplemental features, even on their social media or things from the Criterion channel. Peter Becker sometimes shows up as a host or an interviewer in some of those cases. So a lot of people that were involved early on are still involved with the company to this point, which kind of tells you that they seem to have hit a nerve with the audience that they were producing these home versions on Laserdisc for originally. And there are a lot of things about the Criterion Collection that have made it very unique over the years and have made it last not only for 41 years now ongoing, but also through several different physical media formats. So this is kind of really defined by the company slogans, taglines. I don't know exactly what you would call it necessarily, but they right from the outset of their DVD lines. I don't have any laser discs personally from Criterion, so I'm not sure if this was always on their packaging. But in the early DVD releases, they started with having this little blurb on the back of all of their releases to say that the Criterion Collection was, quote unquote, a continuing series of important classic and contemporary films. This has since been expanded, and they now have a little bit more of a wider definition that if you flip over the back of any of their releases today, you will see mostly kind of on the right side of the back artwork. And the blurb that's on there now says, "The Criterion Collection is dedicated to gathering the greatest films from around the world and publishing them in editions of the highest technical quality, with supplemental features that enhance the appreciation of the art of film." It's quite a manifesto, and it is something that they have lived up to for a bunch of years, and it did start really early on in those Laserdisc days where they, were not only releasing very high quality editions of a lot of films that were not only the international films that Janus Films was distributing, but also a lot of classic films that were harder to see in really good editions that may have been existing for the last 40, 50, even 60 years and may have been in some kind of disrepair. They did do a lot of restoration of a lot of these films that they were releasing. And, the first of their releases were a lot of older films. So the first 5 Laserdiscs they ever made were Citizen Kane, King Kong, Alfred Hitchcock's The 39 Steps and The Lady Vanishes, and The Third Man. These are all films that had existed by that point in time for no less than 30 years. I think The Third Man is maybe the newest of all of those films, which would have been 1949. So they had been around for a long time, and even though you may have gotten a chance to see them at a repertory theater or maybe rented a VHS that had some form of print on these old films, which may or may not have looked okay, it did, give them at least a chance to have something a little bit upgraded, a digital version that could be restored to a higher level than you would see in a VHS restoration. I'm just having a look at the notes that I wrote down for their Laserdisc releases, because again, I'm not as familiar with everything that they did on Laserdisc. Looks like they did 384 total Laserdisc releases, and the last one was actually a year later than I thought, in 1999, with the Michael Bay film Armageddon. This was the last one they released on Laserdisc, which coincidentally they did also do a version on DVD, which is now out of print. Both that one and the other Michael Bay film that they have in the collection, The Rock, came out, I think, around the same year or close to the same time in 98, 99, 2000 era-ish. And, now they don't have the rights to it anymore, so it is out of print. But they did something with those 384 Laserdisc releases that hadn't really been done in physical media before that point in time. Again, I'm not 100% sure. There may have been somebody on VHS doing something similar to this. But they took a cue from certain book releases where you maybe had a series of books that they would be numbered, and you could put them on your shelf and organize them by the number on the spine, almost as if it were an encyclopedia, maybe, and you had, a volume done by letters. In this case, Criterion actually put a spine number to each release they had. So I mentioned Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane was spine number 1. So if you put it on your shelf and you looked on the side, you would see the title, Citizen Kane. You would also see the Criterion Collection on the spine. And near the bottom, you would see the number 1. And then with their second release, King Kong, it was the number 2. So on and so on, down the line until you got to number 384, the last of their Laserdisc releases. This is something that is a lot more commonplace in some physical media, and it does, again, it's a very little minor thing, but it's something that I think they probably have taken from a collector market, a comic book market, even just regular books or other sorts of collectibles that maybe have some kind of a number to them that just added a little bit to the collector mentality of what was there, which was already going to be tapping into something that a lot of cinephiles are probably more likely to get behind. But they believe they were the first to do that with utilizing a spine number. As Laserdisc's life cycle came towards the end of its time in the late 1990s, in fact, even by the mid 90s, it was not really catching on, and not every movie studio was really producing Laserdisc for absolutely everything they were doing. It wasn't really fully being embraced by the market. It was still pretty expensive for a lot of people to get behind. And this is when the DVD started to come around. We talked a little bit about some of the history of DVDs in an earlier episode on this podcast. And Criterion, seeing this change from Laserdisc to DVD being a more compact format, one that had some potential for the price of the technology to come down, they decided that they were going to also start a Criterion Collection on DVD in 1998. So the first of their DVD releases were in this year. In this case, they actually restarted the spine numbering, because at this point in time, they had already had some rights change for their Laserdisc releases going into DVD. I believe at that point in time, something like Citizen Kane, which would have been owned by somebody else at the time, was bought up by Warner Brothers, and I know King Kong would very likely have been the same. The Third Man has changed hands a few times, but I think it was still maybe Studio Canal at that point in time. And the 39 Steps and the Lady Vanishes, being two British Hitchcock films, believe that Janus Films had acquired the rights to those ones and still had them, because they did get released again on DVD. And because of this, they decided to start their DVD collection with new numbers on the spines. So even though they did give numbers to the Laserdisc ones, the continuity of what we know today as the Criterion Collection really started with spine number 1 in 1998, which was Grand Illusion, the Jean Renoir war film. Interestingly enough, that one actually wasn't the first released by the Criterion Collection. There's a very interesting story that goes with it, and if anybody has the out-of-print Grand Illusion Criterion Collection, you can see a little bit of some of that, where even just the way the artwork goes, there's a very distinctive way the artwork that Criterion produced in 1998 very early on looked. And the Grand Illusion disc and case actually looks more like the second iteration of the Criterion Collection design, which came, I believe, a couple of years later. And that's because once they had licensed Grand Illusion, it was in very bad shape. The film print that they had for it had a lot of tearing, a lot of damage. They were really trying their best to restore it. And they undertook a little bit more of a lengthy process for this restoration in sourcing some different original source materials and different film stocks. And it took them some time. It took them almost a year and a half to really get a version of Grand Illusion that they were happy enough with that they could release. It still definitely wasn't perfect, but they did take some time to get this film out there. So even though it was Spine #1, it was delayed for over a year, and then really kind of put forward as this brand new restoration. I believe they even did a theatrical run of it as well, which is pretty common these days for films that are older. They get a big restoration treatment like this. So they had this renumbering of the DVDs, starting not with Grand Illusion, even though it was the one that was given #1, but #2, and the first one they did actually physically put out, is The Seven Samurai, directed by Akira Kurosawa, which is still part of the collection, is one of the films that is, I think, essentially part of what you would call the permanent collection of Janus films. I don't think they're ever going to lose the rights to it. Certainly not at this point, at least. They've had the rights to it for, probably longer than 40 years. I would imagine it goes back to their early days when Seven Samurai had just come out in theater. So this begins the Criterion Collection as we know it today. It continued on DVD up to this day. They still produce DVD versions of everything they do. The addition of Blu-ray versions to the Criterion Collection started in 2008, and then the addition of 4K discs started in 2021. These days, every release is going to get at least a Blu-ray edition. A lot of them are also going to get a 4K edition, and I think everything also will have the DVD lower level version to it as well. So they are still supporting all three currently available versions of physical media. Now, I have mentioned that Criterion and Janus Films are a North American distribution company. They did actually expand this in 2016 to have certain editions of Criterion Collection films available in Region 2 or Region B editions for consumers in the UK and the European markets. So there are some films that they did acquire the rights to make editions for in Europe and be able to create those and distribute those for the European market. These are always films that are also in the North American version. So if you're in Europe and have a region-free player, you could play both versions. In fact, if you're in North America, you could also buy the EU versions of that if you did want to as well. But they have expanded this out. Not every film that they release is available to be released on Criterion. There are some companies that have the rights to maybe a European distribution of a new restoration, whereas the rights to that same film reside with Criterion in North America. So there are films that may have separate versions with different artworks from different companies, but may be sourcing the same restoration or the same film print, or indeed even a lot of the same supplemental features on the disc. It just comes down to a bit of a matter of the rights to distribute that film and to make a product of that film in different parts of the world, which is a very complicated subject that I don't pretend to know anywhere near any kind of enough information to speak on it with any kind of authority. But there are certain films in the Criterion Collection in North America that may have versions, let's say, in the Eureka Masters of Cinema Region B Blu-rays in Europe and in other parts of the world as well. So they they started to produce some of these things in 2016, and they continue to do that to this day. They have also spawned a couple of sub-labels within the Criterion Collection that are also still being produced, and actually one of them is being reintroduced later on this year, which was exciting news to hear from Criterion. This line that I'm speaking of is the Eclipse line. And this is a line of films that aren't given a spine number as a regular Criterion Collection, and they aren't necessarily restored to the same care that a Criterion Collection disc is. But these are films that essentially maybe are not really available in any form at this point in time, or maybe were difficult to find, or were part of a package of films from a certain filmmaker that Janus Films had the rights to, and they wanted to be able to distribute them on a home video. So these were usually done up as collections by a filmmaker, or maybe a time period, or maybe a film movement, or a wide variety of different things that you could theme these around. I do have several of these in my collection. Some of them are by director. I have one that's called Nikatsu Noir, which is about the Nikatsu Film Studio in Japan, and it's a series of 5 film noirs that they released throughout a certain cycle of time during the studio. So it's a lot of different different eclipse sets with different themes to them, and they are going to be starting to produce a few more of these this year. I believe they have one by Abbas Kiarostami, the Iranian director, that is going to come out later this year, which is quite exciting, and hopefully moving forward they continue to do those. These editions are a little bit more bare bones, and we'll talk about the supplements and the things that Criterion Collection discs do usually include. These are typically the film and some subtitles and maybe not much else. Maybe barely an interview here or there, but likely you're going to get a very bare bones film edition. But you do at least get a chance to own it on physical media and watch it at home. The other sub-label under Criterion is actually recently changed names, but it started out as Janus Contemporaries and is going to be changing in the near future to Criterion Premieres. These are films that are getting a first release on physical media from Janus Films / Criterion that have recently come out in theaters. And this is kind of a way for Janus Films and Criterion to release some of the films that they do have theatrical rights to. For a long time, Janus Films did not produce new films. They were producing or distributing, films made in other parts of the world that may have been new at those times, but may have come to the North American market maybe a year after they had been released. Janus wasn't really that involved with the actual producing of brand new films on their own until about 2009, and I believe the first one that they produced is one called Revenge, which is, I may actually be saying that wrong. I don't know if it's Revenge or Revanche, something like that. But it was a film that was produced by Janus Films and did come out in theaters, did get nominated for a lot of awards that year, and came out as a standalone Criterion Collection version. And as the years have gone on and Janus Films has started to produce more of these, they only really had the Criterion Collection as a physical media line that they could produce films for. So sometimes the physical media distribution would maybe get handled by another company, or they would collaborate, because they didn't always necessarily have a film that they felt would fit into the Criterion Collection. As I mentioned, the description of them where they talk about, the greatest films from around the world, it's not that they didn't necessarily believe that these films that they had made were the greatest films in the world, but they also were involved with, getting rights to older films, classic films, other foreign films that may not have been available, and not every brand new thing that they were going to release would necessarily be part of the Criterion Collection. Some would, certainly, and some continue to be to this day. In fact, some of the not-so-distant future releases are going to be Janus Films originals, essentially, for to use the Netflix or Amazon Prime or Apple TV Plus language as one of their originals. So they created the Janus Contemporaries line a few years ago to have that be an avenue where they could still produce a physical media copy of these films that they were producing that are brand new, but not necessarily ones that would have a spine number or be in the quote-unquote collection. They did do a very good job with a lot of these. I only have a couple of them in my own collection, but they have done, some really nice transfers, a little bit of special features here and there. Not, again, quite as thorough or quite as having the kind of depth that something from the Criterion Collection would. But they also have had some new films put on the Criterion Collection and given a little more of that depth treatment to what they're doing. I mentioned recently in the next few weeks, they're about to release the Criterion Collection version of the film Flow, which won Best Animated Feature at last year's Oscars and was a Janus film. And it's made in Latvia, was very much kind of in Janus Films' wheelhouse as to what they would do. And it was kind of a somewhat surprising winner of Best Animated Film. This is an Oscar category that is typically dominated by your Disney's and DreamWorks's and Illumination and Studio Ghibli. To have an independent animated film win this award was quite a big deal. And they, have it sounds like by all accounts, they've done a really good job of collecting whole bunch of wonderful supplements for a Criterion Collection version of this film. So some Janus films are getting a Criterion Collection edition, and if they're not, then they may fall under this Janus Contemporaries, and like I said, going forward, it's now going to be called Criterion Premieres line. I've alluded to this a little bit with some of the depth and some of the extra special aspects of what makes a Criterion Collection disc special or interesting or something that people would want to seek out. And the innovations that Criterion has had over the years in the home video physical media space is pretty impactful. As I mentioned, their Laserdisc line started coming out in 1984, and the world of home video or watching movies at home was a very, very different place at that point in time. One of the most interesting things at that point is that the televisions that were in most homes in North America at that point are not as they are now. The flat screen, widescreen 16:9 aspect ratio TVs that you see anytime you go into any electronics store was not the norm. In fact, didn't even really exist back in the 1980s. All of those screens were a much closer to square-shaped 4:3 aspect ratio, which made it a little bit difficult for some movies to be watched at home, because a lot of movies, if you know anything about the framing or the aspect ratio of a film, a lot of times in the early Hollywood times, the 4:3 aspect ratio was not really used all that much. It was occasionally, but if you were making a prestigious film, then you were very likely going to be filming it in a wider, more rectangular aspect ratio. This is where things like Panavision, VistaVision, all of these different types of technologies that had a little bit wider film strips would show a wider, kind of more vibrant, larger visual when you were in the theater. In fact, sometimes they had to have theaters that had their screens get extended a little bit to show some of these quote-unquote widescreen films. So these films in this aspect ratio could not really be shown on the modern TVs in the 1980s without, adding the black bars on the top and bottom, which is a process that's called letterboxing. Many consumers, in fact, most consumers, did not really like this as a practice because they just thought, well, wait a minute, why am I seeing this little small image and there's all this space on my TV that's not being used? And they basically adopted this practice that has become known as pan and scan, which is a format that for let's say a VHS version of a movie that was in widescreen, they would actually artificially zoom the aspect into the widescreen and cut off some of the real estate on the right and left, or maybe one or the other of the film. So there was a lot of movies that for years and years people watched them and didn't realize that they weren't seeing the entire frame of the film. And the pan part of the pan and scan actually came in that if there was a film maybe where you had two characters on either ends of a widescreen frame, you might only be able to see one of them if you zoomed in artificially like this. And so they would actually add an artificial camera movement with one character talking to another to show the space in between them, which is just kind of ludicrous. I remember this as a kid, and again, I didn't know any different, didn't know that this was really anything to be concerned about, or that oh, this is just part of the movie. But going back and watching it now, you just think like, well, yeah, there's so much space here that wasn't intended. You know, you'd be watching a Hollywood movie where two characters are talking to each other, and it was like the camera was floating weirdly back and forth between them, or you would just miss something entirely. Like there are some films that I have gone back to watch after watching them when I was younger, to then just see, oh, there's a whole thing going on the other side of the frame that they just had to cut off because of the TV format at that point in time. So Criterion was the first to really adopt the letterbox format in the proper aspect ratio for that film as its standard. And it did not matter to them that they would have these black bars on the TV. They wanted to produce the original aspect ratio as it was intended by the filmmakers. And this was a real, priority for them to be able to uphold this because of their commitment of producing the highest quality film that they could possibly put out for the consumers. And this is one of the reasons why cinephiles really took to it early on. The first of their films that they released in this letterbox format was Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which I believe was one of the first 10 or 15 films that they released on Laserdisc. And it essentially became something that they did with all of their releases going forward until eventually the world caught up and TVs started to be made in widescreen format, because everything that was shot on a camera at one point was being shot in some form of a widescreen format. So eventually the technology caught up to Criterion in that case. Because of the digital form of laserdiscs, which again, I've talked a little bit about what a laserdisc is. It's kind of like a big giant DVD that's more of the size of a record and actually does have digital info on either side of it. It's like those kind of primitive double-sided DVDs that they used to make in the early days of DVD. There's a lot more information available on those discs than just the picture and the sound that would go along with the film. And one of the things that Criterion actually invented as part of their release on Laserdisc is an alternate audio commentary track. Now I say this, and most of you are going to say, well, yeah, I have all sorts of movies that have commentary tracks, or I've seen TV show series on DVD that have commentary tracks for each episode. This was invented by Criterion, essentially, for a home video release. The first one of these they ever did was actually on their second release on King Kong. And this commentary track was done a little bit in a slightly different format than what you see nowadays. A lot of times it's a bit of a watch-along commentary where you're watching with some of the filmmakers or maybe actors or the director, producer, somebody that's been involved with it, maybe the screenwriter or an author or even a film critic that has maybe has some expertise on the film or the filmmakers, and they'll offer kind of insights throughout the film. The early commentary tracks, including this one, were a little more of a piecemeal, multiple people talking about the film in different areas that was edited together. And they had almost a little, like a disembodied voice that would introduce these different people. So they weren't in the room talking while watching the film originally. It was sort of like okay, we're going to talk to the director, and they're going to talk for 5 minutes about some aspect of it, and then this voice would come back in and say, now screenwriter so and so, and they talk. So it's almost as if the commentary track was like I'm going to date myself with this reference, but like watching a pop-up music video in the 1990s. Anybody that remembers the VH1's pop-up video will know exactly what I'm talking about. And otherwise, I am making myself feel really, really old to a lot of people. But it is essentially a showing of a music video where they would pop up these little like speech bubbles of information throughout the music video to point out interesting facts or maybe talk about the artist and something that was going on at the time. So it was kind of that. It wasn't necessarily speaking directly to what was on the screen as it was happening, like you see a lot of now with audio commentary tracks, but it was still informative. It was something that you didn't see on a VHS version of a film. And because of the way that information was put onto the DVD, it was just as simple as swapping out the audio track that was playing, which you could manipulate on your Laserdisc remote. So this, essentially was invented by Criterion for their Laserdiscs and has just continued through not only their releases, but also practically every physical media version that you can imagine. Every major label very likely has an alternate audio commentary track for somebody, sometimes multiple audio commentary tracks. This was all started from Criterion in the early 80s, which is pretty astounding that they were able to invent something that has become so ubiquitous. Interestingly enough, this is not the only ubiquitous invention for physical media and home movies that Criterion was involved with being the first for. And the other one is one that, again, is completely taken for granted at this point in time. And it's effectively, I guess, what you could call the supplements, bonus materials, the stuff that makes a special edition of a DVD or a Blu-ray or a 4K a special edition. It's the addition of things like the trailers for the movie, maybe some documentaries that have been filmed or maybe created specifically for the home video release, maybe including of deleted scenes or alternate endings or interviews with different actors or members of the crew or anybody really. It could be maybe retrospectives about maybe an actor or the filmmaker themselves, or something about maybe the genre of what was taking place. There are all of these types of bonus materials that if you collect physical media, you have seen dozens and dozens and hundreds and thousands of. They were invented by the Criterion Collection for Laserdisc. They really made a point of creating what they kind of termed as film school in a box, where you can put in a movie at home, watch the movie, watch it again with an audio commentary, watch a documentary about the star and the director, or see some interviews with the casting director or the editor or cinematographer or composer, or listen to a conversation between another filmmaker and somebody involved with the film you just watched. These bonus materials and supplements are something that are completely ubiquitous in the physical media space now. And Criterion was involved with inventing these, essentially. So, they obviously are really were really ahead of the curve in the 1980s with this. So much so that, effectively speaking, everybody's been iterating on their invention with it since. So it does speak to kind of the innovations and the legacy that the Criterion Collection has over the physical media space. I mentioned a little bit about the film restoration aspect as well. Criterion did spend a lot of time on the film restoration aspect of their releases. They still do. Even with new films, they do make sure a lot of times that they're working with, whenever possible, the filmmakers themselves to make sure that they approve of the transfers and of the maybe restorations or anything that's going on to those releases. I think whenever they can, they really try to get the filmmakers involved or find the best original source material if they have a very old film that they're restoring, to make it as great of an experience for the high definition modern viewers as they possibly can. And a lot of other boutique labels have followed in their footsteps and really engaged a lot of film restoration processes in their own releases too. So they were kind of leading the charge early on with this, and they continue to be near the head of the pack as far as restorations go. They also, over their years, have really been involved in different deals as far as licensing physical home video releases that they don't own. Janus Films is one that really is distributing films that are coming from other parts of the world, other than the films that they do now bankroll on their own. Criterion has released films by effectively every major studio, throughout history. I think at this point in time, they probably are pretty close to having a release for most of these big and small studios. They do work with some modern studios. They have put out releases by Netflix, by Amazon Prime, by Apple, even some smaller, more independent film studios like Neon. I have to look up to see if they've done anything with A24. I feel like maybe they have, but off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure. So please don't hold me to that. But they do work with a lot of these modern studios to also put out some really wonderful editions of newer films, or maybe even ones that were released 10 years ago, 20 years ago, a little bit more in the modern era. And they are very, very adept at signing deals with these movie rights holders to be able to release different films as part of the Criterion Collection. So nowadays, you go through a lot of boutique labels that don't necessarily have a direct connection with owning or having the distribution rights to something from, a Warner Brothers or an MGM or any of those types of places, but may be able to work out deals where they maybe have a short-term licensing deal where for 3 or 4 years they can produce an edition of a film, and then it lapses and maybe somebody else picks up the rights, or maybe the studio themselves puts something out. Maybe the studio does something initially, and then down the road, the company picks up the rights. I know Criterion has recently done that with certain films like No Country for Old Men that had an original home video physical media release through the original studio, and now they're putting out this extra edition, this really special one with all of the supplements, all the commentary tracks, everything like that. So Criterion really was ahead of the curve with striking some of these deals with the different rights holders. And with some of the historical ones, they can be a little bit of a tangled mess. And, some of the films that they don't currently have in print and have lost rights to, some of them they've been able to bring back. Recently, their edition of This Is Spinal Tap, the wonderfully hilarious mockumentary, is about to re-enter the collection in print. It was one of their first 50 films, I think, that ever got produced on DVD. It's going to be really fun to see that on 4K. But they have really been heavily involved with the process of licensing the different movies at different times for different physical media releases that they produce. And it's now a thing that a lot of other companies are following in their footsteps with. So obviously, as you can kind of see with a lot of these, they really have had a really big impact on the physical media landscape over time. Going from Laserdisc to DVD to Blu-ray to 4K, they always are somebody that I think collectors and other people in the movie industry look to and kind of hold up on a little bit of a pedestal as somebody that is kind of doing yeoman's work and being able to have these wonderful, loving editions for cinephiles that do want to collect movies and have them at home and watch them again and again and really deep dive into them. And they were really the first boutique physical media label of their kind from a very early time. So they're, the first is always really impactful, and they're still going very, very strong. In fact, at this point in time in this would be September 2025 when I'm recording this episode, they have just under 1,300 spine number releases as part of the Criterion Collection on DVD, Blu-ray, and 4K. That is an awful lot of films. They cover so many different genres in that span as well. They cover so many areas of the world. They are constantly unearthing new films that really haven't had the kind of wide audience that they would get while being on a Criterion Collection edition. So they are really doing a lot to bring attention to films that deserve it, and to kind of re-earth some classics and create a bit of a renaissance to them, or a rediscovery amongst a lot of viewers that maybe hadn't seen them, or maybe had heard about a film for a very long time that was harder to see, or maybe just something that they saw at one point and they're almost doing a little bit of a critical reevaluation. So their releases have really spearheaded some of that in the physical media space and amongst collectors and cinephiles. They also have made efforts to go back and do an upgraded version of certain previous films that they've released. So I mentioned the first DVD that they did actually physically put out was The Seven Samurai, Spine Number 2. They have gone back a couple of different times and upgraded their own version of The Seven Samurai. The one that currently exists now is available both on DVD, Blu-ray, and on 4K. It's in this wonderful digipack, kind of a matte finish with black and this lovely silver kind of writing, or silvery gray writing on it. It's really wonderful, and they over the years that they've had the rights to it, have taken some of those early releases and said, hey, we really didn't have a lot of supplements in this, or we want to upgrade the restoration to this film because the technology's better and we can make it look even better, even sharper, even more high definition, and add more interviews, add extra context to the releases they have done. So they have taken a lot of efforts to dig back into their own history and see where they may be able to, maybe it's reacquire the rights to a film and do an upgraded edition of it, or maybe it's something that they have had the rights to for a long time that they undertake a new restoration of, or just have more to add to what that film is on the collection. They have also, at different times in their life cycle, really done some interesting things as far as cultivating a bit of an online presence and an online community in different ways. And this goes way back to when I can first remember kind of interacting with any sort of online Criterion community, and it was Criterion Collection's own Facebook page back in the late 2000s, I think it was going. And they really did a lot in the way of sort of promoting some of their new releases, giving a little bit of maybe some advanced videos that were being posted to YouTube that they could bring together for a community and get some discussion going and conversations. They did also run a lot of like community contests. I actually very vividly remember them running a contest on their Facebook page many, many years ago now, where it was a photo contest where you would take a picture of a specific Criterion release, but set it in some sort of a setting that would either suit the film in some way or another, and they would pick like the 10 best entries that they would get over a month. And some of people would publicly post these as they were sort of staging these photos, and I remember doing some myself that were kind of fun to put together. But I remember seeing some of these like staged photos that people were doing. I remember one very vividly actually for the Blu-ray edition of Henri Georges Clouzot's The Wages of Fear, which when I describe this photo, if you've seen the film, you'll kind of know why it's why it's apt to the film. But this person basically took an open version of the film and took the discs out and actually like plunked it down and submerged it into what looks like a puddle of oil. So they were destroying their own discs, which I wouldn't recommend at all. But somebody really went to these like depths of being like, this is and it was a very striking close up. They clearly had a very good camera that they were taking it with. It was a very striking thing, and the creativity was off the charts with some of the community stuff that they did. They did also have one where it was about taking a still image, so like a freeze frame within any film in the Criterion Collection, and submitting it as like a every frame a painting kind of situation. And I remember participating in that. It was really kind of unique to do that, and they engaged people pretty early on in the social media era with those sorts of things. They also have taken full advantage of video as far as a social media platform in the form of YouTube. They've had a YouTube channel going for, oh boy, I'm not exactly sure when it started. I'm sure it was probably pretty close to when YouTube started in about 2005, 2006. And one of the recurring segments or types of videos that they've done on their YouTube channel is the highly beloved Criterion Closet videos. Now, the first one of these was done, I believe, about 15 years ago or so, and it was done with Guillermo del Toro as the, I guess, subject of the video. So if you've never seen a Criterion Closet video, what it is effectively is they film someone that they have invited to their offices in Manhattan, in New York, and they have what probably started out as like a storage closet or a broom closet of some kind, where they have fashioned it with a whole bunch of shelves, and they have put a bunch of editions, versions of every film that is currently in print from Criterion. And they would invite actors, directors, other famous people that maybe were there because one of their films was coming out. Maybe they were just in town because they had a film that was premiering. Maybe they were just a really big fan and they got invited or knew somebody that gave them an invite. And they basically got access to this closet, and they gave them a duffel bag and said, pick out some movies. We'll let you take them home, but we're going to film you and tell us why you picked this film. So it might be a film that they watched as a kid that they really loved, or maybe it was one that really inspired something they've done, or maybe has inspired them through their entire career. Or maybe it's a film that is by a director that they love, or maybe stars an actor that they love, and they've never seen it. And they talk about how much it means to them, and they want to check this out. Or maybe they're going in completely blind. Maybe they've worked with a cinematographer that, shot this film that's in Criterion, and they haven't seen it and they want to see it. So these closet videos have been going on now for, like I said, a very long time, and they are really entertaining a lot of the time. They're the kind of stuff that movie nerds like me love to see and dig into. Like, you could just put them on a loop. In fact, I'm sure there's a YouTube playlist that you could just set them on loop, and like I'm just happy as can be to watch these. They are really engaging. A lot of times they're really funny. There's some really legendary ones like I love Bill Hader's Criterion Closet video where he goes in and like talks about the Japanese wacko horror film House, and he's actually wearing a shirt for the film House that he bought when he saw it in theater, like in the theater re-release that I think Janus Films and Criterion were involved with. So they're really entertaining, and they're the kind of thing that, again, fosters a bit of a community of watchers and of commenters on the YouTube videos. And over the last couple of years, they actually have translated the Criterion Closet video into an experience that their customers can get involved with. I mentioned at the beginning that I was in Toronto for TIFF, for the film festival there, which is a really huge deal. A lot of wonderful films that premiere there, that get into an Oscar race. This year I got to see Sentimental Value by Joachim Trier, which I wouldn't at all be surprised if it was in the Oscar conversation, and may very likely be a candidate to be in the Criterion Collection. Trier's last film, The Worst Person in the World, did get an edition in Criterion, so maybe we'll see a Sentimental Value Criterion in the next year in a bit, who knows. But one of the main reasons I wanted to go to TIFF this year is because Criterion was there, and they brought with them what they are calling the Mobile Criterion Closet. So this started last year at, I believe it was the New York Film Festival at first, where they basically bought what amounts to sort of like a food truck, like a larger delivery van sort of thing. But instead of having it be a food truck with a kitchen or a delivery van where a bunch of packages would go, they recreated the Criterion Closet in this vehicle. And they parked it at the New York Film Festival and gave regular people like you and me the opportunity to line up to have a Criterion Closet experience in the mobile closet that they parked at the festival, which is, for somebody like me, a supremely cool thing to do. And I remember seeing, pictures and videos of when they did it at the New York Film Fest. It looked amazing. I, thought, oh, this would be amazing. I would love to do this. And they did do it a little later on the next year, or I believe later on in the year, in Los Angeles at Vidiot's, which is a really, really well-known video rental store. And I believe also it shares a theater in there. I've never been to Vidiot's. I would really love to go. But they also went to South by Southwest in Texas, and they announced that they were going to be at the Toronto Film Festival this year. So they were going to be at TIFF, and I decided that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and I bought myself a plane ticket. I have some very, very nice and kind relatives that I was able to stay with in Toronto, and got the chance to line up with a whole bunch of other physical media people like me, and got to film a video and choose 3 films from the Criterion Closet on King Street in Toronto. And it was wonderful, and that was part of my reason for taking an extra week, because I was in TIFF doing the mobile closet, as well as seeing some films and experiencing the film festival as a whole, which I'd never really been to a big film festival like that. And the mobile closet was the icing on the cake. It was an absolutely excellent experience. I met a whole bunch of new friends in line. Actually, they kind of group you up to go into the mobile closet, just to kind of get as many people through the experience as they can, to give them a chance to do it. And I went in with, as a group of 4 with 3 other people that I had met that morning when I lined up at 8:30 with a coffee and a backpack and a coat on. And the only thing we really had in common was we were there for the film festival, and we all loved physical media. And when they told us we were going to be grouping up, we all became very fast friends, and spent about 4 hours or so in the lineup before we got into the closet experience itself. But it was amazing. It honestly was an incredible experience to be able to do. If you are ever in an area or you can get to a festival or an event where they have the mobile closet available and you're a physical media person, I can highly recommend it. It was a wonderful experience. I would love to, see it again. I'd love to go back to TIFF again. That was an excellent time. I may go for even longer next time I do that. But, it speaks to this online community and presence that they are able to advertise this out and have, people lined up and wait in line for up to, even longer than I did. Like I got there very, very early, and there were people that were probably waiting in line for 5, 6, 7, even 8 hours to get in to do this. It kind of showed me that physical media is alive and well still, which it kind of made my heart warm. And I thought, hey, maybe I'm doing a podcast about something lots of people are interested in still. So they have really put a lot of thought into community engagement and these sorts of experiences. And I know they also have, been involved with some screenings in different areas that maybe are a little bit closer to where they are in New York or Los Angeles, or just even showing off some of the restorations they've done in theaters with some fun kind of road shows and special presentations. They have really done a lot to engage their community online for a lot of different iterations of the internet. The other, impact and bit of legacy that Criterion Collection has had is something that I have mentioned before, which is their own streaming app, which is the Criterion Channel. This is an app that has a lot of the Criterion Collection films available to stream. Not all of them, because again, with film rights, some of the films that are in the collection may not have, the Criterion may not have the ability to show them on their own app. They may be on Amazon Prime or Netflix or, it's somewhere else. So it does give them an ability to show those, but also to maybe showcase other films. There are far more films on the Criterion Channel that are not in the Criterion Collection themselves. So it does give you a bit of a second avenue of some more discovery of films that may not ever get into the collection, but they do get a chance to show them for maybe a long term, maybe a few months, maybe as part of a collection that they curate, whether it's a part of the world or, a certain amount of films by a director. I know this month in September, because Paul Thomas Anderson has a new film, One Battle After Another, coming out. They are doing a small collection of Paul Thomas Anderson films on the Criterion channel, which will probably be there for probably not a long time, but maybe a few months to get people excited to go see One Battle After Another. But they have been able to do that because of the name that Criterion has built as a physical media provider. They have made a really huge impact in the movie space, not just in the physical media space. And their innovations and their impact in the physical media space are pretty vast, as we've talked about a little bit. And they are kind of a lot of times the first boutique physical media label that people will think of for a reason. They've been doing it for 40 plus years and doing it really, really well, as well as pretty much anybody has done over a lot of years. And they've inspired a lot of other wonderful companies to be created, to do what they're doing, but in their own way. And, they are still around and still producing some great editions of films. I've been a collector of Criterion Collection stuff since about 2002, when I first got a DVD player. In fact, one of my first 2 DVDs that I ever bought was the Criterion Collection DVD of the Royal Tenenbaums. So they have been in my collecting life for a very, very long time now. And this is why I also want to have a bit of a recurring series about Criterion. So when I do these episodes going forward about sort of label introductions or boutique label introductions like this, if they're ones that I'm familiar with, I want to do it in a similar format to what I've just done. Talk a little bit about the history of that company, what they do so well, how long they've been doing it for, what kind of a slant do they take with what they release, and some recommendations on maybe where to start or things you might be interested in, read if you like sort of thing. But instead of for articles or books, it's for boutique movies on physical media. That question of where to start with Criterion is very difficult, as you can imagine, with almost 1,300 releases. It's a little bit intimidating, if I'll be honest with you. If I was just getting into it right now, that is a bit of a huge hill to climb. And it's the kind of thing where a lot of people, I could imagine, would find it really difficult to know exactly where to start. And, and we've talked about collecting and the different ways you can collect. And best way to start is usually find a film you really like. And if Criterion's put it out, it's probably a pretty great edition to check out. And that's a good way to at least get you going to see what Criterion's all about and what the hype is around these releases. But because there are so many films, I did want, instead of just making some recommendations in the episode, to have it be a recurring series, because there's so very much that I would love to talk about with Criterion. So I am going to do, in this episode and having some standalone episodes going forward, I'm going to start something that I'm going to call the Criterion Hall of Fame. Now, I want this to be not a formalized, like, oh, this is what is the absolute must-haves in everyone's collection. Because as I've spoken about in my previous episodes, I don't really believe that there is like a must-have that everyone must own in a collection. I don't think that's true. I really do think that everybody should collect their own way. But what I want to do in this case is to say, hey, here are some releases that this company has done that are really exemplary, that are really great for one reason or another. And they may not all be for the same reason. All of the releases are quite unique and have their own unique features to them. So when I do one of these episodes going forward, I think I probably want to have maybe two releases per episode that I can talk a little bit about. And go through a little bit of what makes it special, what makes it interesting, what makes it worth your time if you're interested in checking it out. Unless I do maybe a box set, and in that case, maybe I'll just focus on that in an episode. But because this is part of the Criterion label introduction, today we're just going to talk about one. So this will be my first entry, I guess you could say, into the Criterion Hall of Fame that is not definitive at all and is the cinema on a shelf Criterion Hall of Fame. And in doing so, because I was talking about the history of Criterion before, I didn't want to pick a film that is necessarily part of the Janus Films history, even though there are obviously a huge amount of wonderful Criterion Collection films by, Kurosawa, Antonioni, Fellini, Ozu. Rather than do one of those, I wanted to do one that stands out to me, that is something that they really undertook as, kind of the best, really the best edition of something that had been released up to that point, and even going forward, because this film is one that they did release on Blu-ray in 2010 and DVD as well, but has not had a 4K upgrade on Criterion or anywhere else. And I have to wonder if it's not because this edition was so excellent that maybe doing a 4K of it doesn't maybe even provide a huge enough lift. I don't know. I haven't seen the 4K of this film yet. The film that I'm going to be including as the first in the Hall of Fame is 1998's The Thin Red Line, which is directed by Terrance Malick. Now, Terrance Malick is a filmmaker that Criterion has done editions for over and over and over again. In fact, I believe he has, oh boy, I want to say potentially 5 of his films in the Criterion Collection. There would be Badlands, which was his first film, Days of Heaven, which is his second, The Thin Red Line being his third, The New World, which he did after The Thin Red Line, and The Tree of Life. And I believe that is it. Again, don't at me in the comments if I'm wrong about that. But they have worked a lot with Terrance Malick. And in this case, they did actually work both with Terrance Malick and the cinematographer of the film, John Toll, on this edition. And it is a director and cinematographer approved edition. Didn't necessarily have to be restored in the same way that an older film would, being that it was 1998, so it was only a 12-year-old film at that point in time. But they really did, a pretty astounding job with the picture and sound quality of this release. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not the type of person that's looking for the absolute best and absolute highest definition of these sorts of things with picture and sound. I can appreciate any of these films that, even if they're in a bit of disrepair, how much work has gone into a restoration. That being said, man, oh boy, does this film look and sound incredible in this edition. To give you a bit of context, and I don't know that I necessarily want to talk as much about the film. This isn't a film review of The Thin Red Line. There are lots of those available. The Thin Red Line was an incredibly well-received film when it came out in the very end of 1998 going into 1999. And it's a World War II film that follows a command of soldiers that were fighting the war in and around the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific, specifically in the area of the Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, which was a very, very well-known strategic airfield at that point in time, and was something that the Allied forces were trying to take from the Japanese forces and push them away from and hold as a bit of a stronghold, and something that they could deploy their armies to the rest of the Pacific theater in. if you know anything about World War II, this is probably relatively familiar. This film, as a World War II film, came out the same year as Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, which was a huge runaway box office success, a huge success at a lot of awards. But so was The Thin Red Line. It's very interesting, actually, that these two films about, a similar subject in the same war, different parts of the war, mind you, were both nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars when there was only 5 Best Picture nominees. But, through history, they have both had an interesting lifespan of how they're perceived. And, Saving Private Ryan is an incredibly engaging film. Obviously, the storming the beaches on D-Day is, the opening 20 minutes of that film are some of the most astounding, war ever put to cinema. Really, it really does feel like you're in a very, very bloody, very violent conflict. And the rest of the film as it goes on is, one that I really enjoy watching. But as I've gotten older, I have really found that I gravitate to The Thin Red Line far, far more. In fact, I'm pretty confident in saying that The Thin Red Line is in and among the greatest war films ever made, in my own opinion. And, that's high praise considering how many war films have been released throughout the decades and decades and decades since the wars that they are depicting. But this one really hits something in what I love about films. It's very contemplative. It's also very beautiful. And that's the thing about that, with Saving Private Ryan, it does really capture the grime of European World War II. This captures something in, the islands in the South Pacific that was this beautiful, picturesque, windswept, nature-filled place where this incredibly violent conflict was happening. The juxtaposition of it, I absolutely adore. And the film on the Criterion Blu-ray that I have looks absolutely outstanding, like jaw-dropping in a lot of ways, and a lot of that is owed to the way the film is. The sound is incredible. I actually love when you put the disc into the player on this one. When you go to play the film, there's actually a bit of a prompt that the filmmakers have asked that you play this really loudly on your speakers or on your television, which is I'd never actually experienced on a Criterion DVD or anywhere at all, which I thought was pretty astounding. Until I watched it and did turn it up and thought, oh, that's why. The sound design on this film is incredible, and the fact that they took the time to really refine and really bring that forward in the sound mix is really exemplary, and is among some of the best work that Criterion's ever done in their 40 years. Well, I guess 40 years of doing releases. Maybe I didn't do laserdiscs before, so can definitely say in the 30 years of the DVD, Blu-ray, 4Ks they've done, it still is one that absolutely holds up. And in watching it again before this episode, really just confirmed how absolutely astonishing it is to watch this film. Yeah, it really is amazing to just watch. And it also is a really exemplary example of what Criterion does in the supplemental feature aspect of things. Now, oftentimes with supplemental bonus materials on a physical media release, you are often hearing from the director as well as other people involved with the film, actors and actresses, writers, editors, cinematographers, producers, film critics, who knows. This film and Terrance Malick's other films on Criterion provide a bit of an interesting challenge to that, in that Terrance Malick very famously does not like to do interviews or talk about his films to the public once they're released, before they're released, at any point in time, really. He is a very soft-spoken individual. He really does not like the spotlight, which is interesting that he is a filmmaker and does that. But he also took a very long period of time in between his second film, Days of Heaven, and The Thin Red Line. In fact, I want to say that it was maybe 20 years or so in between Days of Heaven and The Thin Red Line. And, when the film was getting made originally, people were kind of amazed that it was, oh my God, Terrance Malick is making a film again. So there was a real buzz around a lot of actors in Hollywood that wanted to audition for this film. And so when you were doing the supplements, that presents a challenge in that you can't speak to the director, even though he is alive and well, is not interested in doing these reflections or these interviews about it. So what you do is you take different avenues to look at this film with the supplements, and Criterion's done a wonderful job in this edition. It has an excellent compilation of interviews with different actors from the film, which include people like Sean Penn, Jim Caviezel, Elias Koteas, Thomas Jane, Kirk Acevedo, Dash Mihok. There's also a lot of other people in this film, so it's a very ensemble piece. There are people like Woody Harrelson, Nick Nolte plays a very prominent role. George Clooney has a very interesting cameo role. John Cusack is in it. Nick Stahl, a very young Nick Stahl, is in this film. A lot of other actors were either auditioning for or cast in smaller roles, or were cast and then cut out in the editing room. Mickey Rourke was one of those that did act on the film but was cut out, didn't end up making the final cut. Other people that were, had much smaller roles, people like Tim Blake Nelson, that now you are a little more recognizable, did go out for this film because they were all really interested in working with Terrance Malick specifically. People had seen and loved Badlands and Days of Heaven. They'd grown in stature over the years, decades really. And so their insights into the casting process, into the filming process, into the process of going through boot camp. They actually went through a boot camp, a lot of the actors did, to get into combat shape and to get used to being there and working as a team. And then actually shooting the film on location in Guadalcanal and in parts of the Solomon Islands, where they really a lot of them didn't really ever get a chance to shoot films in somewhere like that. So there's a lot of really interesting insights that they were able to bring to the film that kind of show that aspect of how the production went. You also have a really wonderful interview with Diane Crittenden, who is the casting director. So again, giving a different side to the casting and the actors that were there, but also showing a little bit of archival footage for some of the people that went out for the film. There are people like Philip Seymour Hoffman that auditioned and did not get cast. Josh Hartnett that auditioned and did not get cast. All of these people, like it sounded like if you were a male actor in the late 90s in Hollywood, you auditioned for this film. It seemed like everybody came out for it. Everybody was interested in it. And the insight that she was able to bring added another dimension to, what you had heard from the cast and what you see on screen, and really bringing together the idea of like bringing these actors together to feel like they are a bunch of people in an army, squadron. They're not just a bunch of stars. They weren't remaking The Dirty Dozen or The Great Escape, where you did have some big stars, some big starring roles. You had people like Jim Caviezel, who was not a very well-known actor, in as close to what you would call the leading role as you can get in this film. You had people like Adrian Brody, who was not really very well known as an actor in a very prominent role, playing alongside people like John Cusack, that was a lot more well known, but had a much smaller role. Woody Harrelson, same thing. George Clooney showing up just barely. John Travolta is in this film for a very small amount of time. And it's a real true ensemble piece. And Diane, as the casting director, really added to how Terrance Malick saw that, how the casting process went, and how they came together as a cast for that. So it added a really interesting dimension to what was available there. Another interesting aspect to what was available in the supplements was the daughter of the author of the original book. So The Thin Red Line is based on a novel by James Jones, who was a soldier himself. And his daughter, Kaylee Jones, did an interview for the Criterion Collection edition about her father and about how, he was approached by Terrance Malick to have this turned into a film, and some of the differences between the film and the novel, and how, each person saw things a little bit differently. James Jones's reaction to the film, his reaction to war films in general, which I'll actually touch on again in a second related to James Jones. But it again provides this extra bit of context to how this story comes about, how it becomes a film, how it gets adapted into something, which is a kind of a unique experience from adapting something as a novel into something that goes on screen. And the film is very much its own thing, and the book is its own thing. I haven't read the book myself, but from what I've been able to gather from watching this documentary, it does sort of stand on its own as something similar but unique into itself. This viewpoint also does morph and shift a little bit into another set of interviews with the three editors that worked on the film, who are Billy Weber, Leslie Jones, and Sar Klein, who they're all interviewed individually to talk about their work on the film, because it was a very big film, very long film. They shot over 1 million feet of film for this film, so a lot of it did end up on the cutting room floor. And as they were editing, a lot of times they were really working out how exactly the story of the Thin Red Line was going to feel and was going to look, and how some of the voiceover bits in the film come in from the different characters, and really seeing, whose story was going to have a real big impact. And at different cuts, at different times, it felt like certain actors and certain characters were going to be a little more prominent and then were pulled back near the end, or these morphed as it was going. So they really talked about working with Terrance Malick, and how he sort of saw this as a vision to really say, hey, we're going to get all of this wonderful stuff, and it's going to come in different places, and it's going to feel a little bit scattered, but we're going to really create something unique by seeing what we have and really focusing on some of these really interesting bits, which it doesn't sound like to me that's the way all films get made. I think a lot of times you have a very definite shooting script that's going to be edited in a certain way to go with this and have the continuity. And it sounded like with this film, they really did have a lot of freedom to insert extra nature shots and do interesting things with sound and with the voiceover and flashbacks, and showing a lot of things that maybe a more traditional film would not have utilized. And you also get an interesting perspective outside of that from a different aspect of the film, and talking about the sound and the score with the composer Hans Zimmer, who now has become very, very famous for working with people like Christopher Nolan and other, big-time filmmakers. And at this point in time, he was a well-known film composer, but, kind of was a little bit more of an up-and-comer in 1998. And he was also friends with Terrance Malick, became friends. I believe he said they lived together at one point in time, nearish to when this film was going on. And, his work on the score and his work with Terrance specifically, and seeing different cuts of the early parts of the film. So because you didn't have a chance to talk to the director, as all of the people at Criterion, didn't get him on an interview or on camera, because that was not what he wanted to do, they did an incredibly thorough job of bringing in all of these other people involved in the film to really give this very deep impression of what working on this film was like, and the different perceptions of it, and the different perspectives of, what it was like on the casting side of things, what it was like on the shooting end of things, what it was like to go through the boot camp, what it was like to come back for the voiceover, what it was like in Sean Penn's case. It sounded like he was really involved with actually getting people excited and getting the film kind of made and financed in some ways. So there's a lot of really interesting ways that, even though they weren't able to talk to Terrance Malick on camera directly, that you get this really full picture of how this film came together and really came to be something special as it's lived on through the years. To get a little bit more into the technical part of it, they actually utilized the audio commentary track for this disc by enlisting John Toll, the cinematographer, Jack Fisk, the production designer, and Grant Hill, who was a producer on the film, to give a lot of direct behind the scenes feedback as the film is running. So the commentary gives you a unique opportunity to comment directly on kind of what's going on with that. And this commentary track was really informative. It's probably, I can imagine, if somebody is going through film school and is really learning about cinematography and about some of the production design aspects, this would be, like catnip to them. It really, at some points it does get really technical, and there were some things that even I had to pause a little bit and kind of go like, what exactly are they referring to here? And, yeah, overall, I think it's a really informative commentary track, and again adds another dimension to this picture of what creating this film was like. Not necessarily a critical response or a critical evaluation. In fact, this whole release didn't really have that, but this did give you a real inside look at just how this very large scale film, something that Terrance Malick had never undertaken before, was able to bring together in what was a pretty stunning set of results if you've seen the film. There are also a series of deleted scenes, of which there are numerous. I'm sure they could fill 3 more Blu-ray discs with deleted scenes, including one of the ones that some of the extra actors that were cut out of the film in the final cut, Mickey Rourke being one of them. You do get to see him in some scenes and how he might have been utilized. So that was quite interesting, sort of a nice little Easter egg kind of nugget to add to all the other supplements. And there was also these wonderful little inclusions of several different newsreels from the World War II era, the types of things that would run before movies in the 1940s as World War II was happening. And they are all ones that related specifically to the battles in the Solomon Islands and specifically in the Guadalcanal. Propaganda films for sure, so you have to kind of watch them with that in mind. That they make it seem like things were a lot rosier than what was actually going on with that part of World War II. But again, really nice little inclusions just to give you a little bit of extra context, a little bit of historical context to the subject of this film. The other part that Criterion also does a really good job with that I didn't mention before is they often include booklets in with their releases. And in these booklets, they have a lot of different information. Some of them have extra visual accompaniments, whether it's posters or other promotional materials or production materials that they show off. Oftentimes they do include essays, like written essays that were either commissioned specifically for the Criterion Collection edition or are reprints of maybe other articles or things that are somehow related to the film that, again, give an extra little bit of context to somebody really wanting to dive into it. The booklet for The Thin Red Line is pretty good size one. It's about 32, 33 pages, I believe, something like that. And it does include 2 essays, one of which is a newer essay by film critic David Starrett called The Other Side, or This Side of Paradise, pardon me, which is a little more of I guess what you would say the critical bent to the film that maybe isn't on the supplements, but you do get a little bit of a reading of the film in that way. But of the 2 things that are included in the booklet, the one that personally I was really highly engaged with is the second one, which is called Phony War Films, and it is a reprint of an article from 1963 written by James Jones, the author of the original novel of The Thin Red Line. And as James Jones was a soldier, he has a very interesting perspective about war films, and his article kind of talks about that, of how after he came home from World War II and saw some of the John Wayne war films like Bataan and Back to Bataan, kind of laughing in the theater inappropriately at just how unrealistic and super glossed over it was. It really didn't depict how violent the conflict was, how ambivalent and just up to luck and chance and kind of a randomized numbers game of humans throwing each other at humans and shooting each other with guns. that World War II really was. And it's something that he, when he went in to write the novels that he wrote about war, which he wrote numerous novels, in fact, several of them have also been made into films, that he tried to really, embed the realistic soldier experience into that he didn't really see in the Hollywood movies. And this article, being that it was, about 20 years removed from World War II, a little bit less than that, I guess. And the whole impetus of this article was that he was watching a few modern war films, which at that point in time, some of the ones that he mentioned, films like The Guns of Navarone, which was a very, very big film in 1962-63, around that area. And huge box office hit, but was very much like a story-driven war film with a lot of liberties taken and not a lot of the realistic horrors of war in it necessarily. And he tries to sort of reckon with that in this article, and he's a little bit critical of pretty much every Hollywood war film that he watches for it. He said he went through a 3-day binge of watching Hollywood war films, one of which was The Guns of Navarone, and several others. Some I've seen, some I haven't, and kind of gives a little bit of comment about some of the tropes that Hollywood films were using about the heroic figure, or the father figure, the sort of like unflappable moral compass of the film that maybe doesn't always win, but is proven that, in the context or the hindsight that the audience has, that they're doing the right thing even if they don't win in the end. Films like Paths of Glory, Stanley Kubrick's wonderful World War I film, he does point out that while it is not a very pro-war film, and it does kind of have some aspects of anti-war films, it still is, not really portraying the horrors of the war in the way that were realistic. And some of his points about Paths of Glory, I love Paths of Glory personally, and I think he was pretty critical about some of that, and probably in a way that someone that's endured that kind of conflict would be, I suppose, of any kind of Hollywood product about it. But it was really interesting to engage with, because it is an incredibly interesting perspective, and talked about how most of these films, even though they may masquerade as a quote-unquote anti-war film, don't really actually show a lot of anti-war sentiment. And The Thin Red Line as a film really, really feels like an anti-war film. It is not a flattering look at war, despite it being taking place in a beautiful place. It really is unflinching at what it does to the men that fought in those wars, and the people that they're fighting against, and the people that live in the areas where they were fighting with. It's a pretty, unfortunately, it is still very relevant as far as a message goes. And, the edition that Criterion has been able to put together for this film is still one of the finest in my Criterion collection. Again, like I said, pulling it off the shelf to be the first in the Criterion Hall of Fame was really special to watch again. It had been a number of years since I had seen it. This is a really exemplary example of how Criterion can add a lot of depth in a physical media release, in watching something at home, in watching it again and again if it's something you're interested in, and also providing the kind of context that somebody like me, being a big gigantic cinephile, really wants to see from a film like that. And it's something that Criterion really specializes in. It is obviously my first entry in the Criterion Hall of Fame for a reason, and it is still in print, currently widely available. No 4K disc, as I mentioned, but the Blu-ray and DVD that are available are absolutely stunning to watch. If you've seen the film before, watching it in this edition is a real treat, and getting to see it when the care that it's been given is really exemplary. And if you've never seen The Thin Red Line before, it is a film I can highly recommend checking out at any point in time, whether it is the Criterion Collection edition, in a repertory theater. I don't know if it's streaming anywhere at this point in time, but it's a very special, very contemplative war film, but also one that does not pull any punches and does show, have these massive action set pieces that were really done by the actors, and you can tell the care that was taken in this film, and it leaves you with a lot to think about, which is something that I personally really love about subjects when you're talking about something like World War II or any kind of war. It's really nice to be, as an audience member, treated with some respect, in that I'm going to leave you with something to think about. I'm not going to tell you how to think about the whole way through. And I think Criterion has really done something special with it. And if you've seen it before, if you want to check it out, maybe this recommendation will help you out with that. And I think that would be where I would like to leave this episode, being the first boutique label introduction, and also the first of the Criterion Hall of Fame. So I hope you're able to maybe learn something new about the Criterion Collection. If you're a longtime collector, maybe there's something in here that you didn't know about before, or maybe I've just motivated you to go to the mobile Criterion closet the next time it's parked outside of a film festival or event near you. And maybe if you're new to the Criterion Collection, maybe you found a place to start. Maybe there's a little bit of information that can help you with getting started. But, happy to keep the conversation going with multiple other episodes, and hope you dive in head first with Criterion. You won't regret it. In my next episode, I would like to take a little bit of a different bent to the boutique label introduction, but in this case, I'm going to be introducing a label to myself, something that I've never actually seen before. And I've acquired a few releases from this boutique label, and I am going to embark on watching some movies over the next couple of weeks and forming some thoughts about them, and giving myself an introduction to indicator films. So next time on Cinema on a Shelf will be label discovery, and it will be indicator films. So until next time, my name is Matt. Thank you again for listening. Take care.